Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards here, and this is the Ultraviolet Podcast. And today I am joined by Contraband of the Contraband Wagon, a YouTuber slash live streamer slash conversation coordinator who goes out of his way to have productive conversations about race and racism in America. He hosts regular live streams with all different types of people to try and move the needle forward on a progressive approach to race relations in our country. And I really like what he does, and I think he's a great dude to follow, and I was really happy to get him on the show. We had a really fun conversation where we talk about how he came to be doing what he's doing, the progress he's made, the stumbling blocks he's encountered, how he's navigated those, and what we both think needs to happen to have a more productive conversation and actually make material change in terms of anti-racism in American politics. It was a really fun conversation, and if I time the editing of this right, I should be appearing on his live stream either the day that this episode drops or very nearly around it. So be sure and check out the links to Contraband's content in the show notes, and I should be either about to appear or have just appeared on his stream to have a conversation with him about my experiences growing up as a white American and coming to terms with the racial inequality in America, which I'm sure will be fun and excellent, just like this conversation was. And without any further delay, I give you Contraband. Contraband, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you inviting me on.
Absolutely. So you run a website slash YouTube channel slash stream, I believe, called the Contraband Wagon, where you primarily, it seems, talk a lot about race and race relations and all that kind of stuff. And why don't you just tell people kind of what you do and how you got into doing that?
Sure. So what kind of happened is I relocated geographically from New York City back to my hometown in North Carolina. And at that time, I was looking for different ways to make an impact in my community. I was volunteer tutoring students in poor areas. But one thing that, was real, I've always been really passionate about the subject of race. And for more people who want to understand why and more about kind of the origins of my interest and curiosity in that subject matter, you can go to my YouTube channel of the same name, The Contraband Wagon. And there's a poem that I wrote called Contraband of Race War that you can check out. It kind of explains my journey. But at this point in my journey, when I was kind of, moving back towards my family and my roots and whatnot, and rejoining a community that I had once been a part of, I wanted to get out there and bring my conversation about race to the community and invite other people to into that conversation. So I started a meetup.com/racism discussion group. It's still going strong today. We have an event today, in fact. And I was meeting with people in person of all different political persuasions and all different viewpoints about race to have dialogue in person and some food and drink. And we would get together. Sometimes we'd have pre-readings, this and that. And they were all very positive, and a lot of stuff started coming out. I started noticing different patterns. I started recognizing the utility of our conversations and the benefits that people expressed to me. And also just patterns in what people were saying. And I enjoyed that for some time, but then the pandemic hit and we could no longer meet in person. So that's when I kind of transferred to online. I really have no intention of becoming like a full-time content creator or anything like that, but Twitch has allowed me to kind of change what I was doing in a way that I like, which is having one-on-one live conversations with strangers about race, typically 2 hours long on Tuesday and Friday evenings. And then I've been sporadically releasing clips on my YouTube channel, but that'll be happening regularly in the near future. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Nice. So that's I'm sad to hear that the in-person stuff died down, but that's totally understandable.
I mean, I
So
hope to pick it back up. We could talk about that too, but ultimately, live events is my goal, in
yeah.
fact.
Well, and you certainly have more reach. And well, well, let me ask you this, because I kind of want to get people to understand where you're coming from personally, and then we can talk about the kind of people that you have on your show, because you talk to a pretty wide swath of people. Like, um, you're very much in the camp of like willingness to have conversations with a lot of different types of people. But where do you personally come from in terms of your relationship to like the topics of the day, like anti-racism, racism, that kind of stuff? Like, what's your primary school of thought and approach there?
Um, well, okay. I guess no one's really ever asked me to generally just describe that, but I'm going to give it a shot here. Um, where to start? Well, I guess what I would say is uh, one thing that I noticed is that a lot of people don't really have much education about race,
Mm,
don't really understand race, especially racialized white people. And when I say racialized white people, I mean, obviously a racial hierarchy was imposed on all of us of all quote unquote races. And so we've all been racialized. But racialized white people, I think, have a really difficult time getting education about race because you're not getting it in school. You're not getting it really typically at home. And you're not really getting it from your community in any other way, typically. So the only way you can really get it is by seeking it out. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing is to give people an option, a place they can go to learn, a place they can go to communicate about this. And also, there's a lot of fear in the racialized right community about communicating and thinking about these issues about race, from what I've observed. And so I hope to, kind of remove some of that fear factor as well. But ultimately, I think that racism is a problem that has had an immeasurable deleterious effect on our society and on humanity as a whole. And I think that that effect and those consequences are far beyond the scope of most people's imaginations. And so, therefore, uh, my goal is just to kind of move people in a direction where they have more ability and understanding of those consequences, ability to take in those consequences and understand what they are. And I think that's a good starting point to building more empathy, which I think is very important in the context of getting more people to understand how race affects our society because, um, you know, it's a singular experience living in a society where your history is that, you were enslaved, uh, uh, by the government and and then worked for generations to get out of that and to be recognized as a full human being, and that just happened like what, like 60 years ago. So,
yeah, like
um,
3 people ago.
yeah, so it's it's my goal, I guess, and my viewpoint is just to get more people to understand that narrative, you could say, I guess, but most people have a hard time separating the idea, I think, of slavery from the idea of a tyrannical racial hierarchy that was imposed and propagated by the government. While they're obviously inextricably related, there's some substantial differences, that I think a lot of people miss. And I think that's where you get arguments from people saying, like, well, slavery happened everywhere, or stuff like that, because there's just an ignorance about the unique nature of chattel slavery and its ties to racism in the United States.
Yeah,
I just want to educate people. As a teacher, it's my thing.
yeah, yeah. And so it sounds like you're of the camp that views race in the modern conception as a social construct that is, as you said, imposed down on us, not just black people, but white people as well, and like this hierarchical stratification. Like, would you
Yeah, I mean
Like
that's
that.
historical fact,
Yeah.
Like I mean,
Cool.
so yeah, I try not to talk too much about that because
Mhm.
there in this context, and I'm sure you've encountered it as well. Like there's conflict about what historical facts are. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but yeah,
For
I think
sure.
most people, if we lay it out that way, tend to agree. I haven't really had anyone disagree with the way you just put it. So yeah,
Yeah. Well, so that's also a hobby horse of this channel. Like we certainly I'm not as much of an active educator as you, but I certainly do. I view myself more as a propagandist, if I'm being very serious.
okay,
But I do think that getting that message to white people in particular is important, and it's challenging. And I'm very interested in your personal approach, which seems very different from mine. What successes have you had with that? Like, have people been receptive to how you've? Well, let me ask you this: like, what is your approach, and then how receptive have people been to it?
well, I mean, I guess I would describe my approach as I kind of treated the same way that I approach teaching mathematics. Um, I have specialized knowledge being a Black American. Um, having studied the history of anti-blackness and white supremacy in the United States, having learned and continuing to learn more about it. Um, and most people are not in that camp. Most people are just not in that camp, right? So my approach basically is to start off like instead of beating people over the head with all the knowledge that I've gained, and all the insight that I have, because it doesn't work. I find that people um, either come in already believing a lot of the stuff that I believe, or they come in um, primed to disagree with anything that I believe, right? So, my approach, therefore, is to try to find some common ground. The way that I do that is by trying to understand people's evolution of race consciousness. Okay, so everybody has a moment, whether you remember it or not, where they realize that people are stratified into races, right?
Hmm.
And they have a moment where they realize that some races are on a high in a hierarchy are higher than others. So I try to narrow down where those moments are for people, and that brings out a lot of stuff. Um, you know, experiences, thoughts about race, and then I kind of just go from there and like kind of try to get a map of what information they have gained, how they've gained it, um, how they've built their thoughts on the subject matter. Um, I know that it was important for me to do that work for myself when I was making changes to my own thoughts about race, and we can talk about that as well if you want. But yeah, like that's where I start. I start by trying to understand people's evolution of race consciousness and try to find some common ground as well. I spend a lot of time making sure they understand that I view them as a individual, unique human being deserving of respect, and that I, expect the same thing. Normally that goes very well. And then from there, it's just about seeing if some of the information that I've learned through my study can get through, right? Whether they want to hear it, whether I can make them think differently about some of the experiences that they've had. Maybe I could show them an alternative perspective that they were unaware of. Um, yeah. So that's kind of what I do.
Good. Have you found that you've had more or less success with people in getting through to them on this subject, particularly white people, um, who have spent their lives largely separate from other races versus those who have had a more cosmopolitan existence? Because I've found, like, in my personal life and in like my professional life and just people that I've spoken to, those who are the most resistant to this sort of to onboarding this idea of not only is race like this nebulous social thing, but it also has a historical imposition on people in a way that many other things do not, and that has long-term consequences. That whole thing that you and I probably align almost completely on just from our Twitter exchanges. Like getting people to onboard that and sign off on that, to me, seems to be far easier if they've ever like literally just talked to a black person, let alone like spent actual time around like people and like had communal relationships with people. Like, do you find that that's true? And like, how do you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Uh,
100%. You were about to ask, how do I?
how do you? For those that don't have that, who have those walls up that come from like uh, that type of isolation, how do you find that you get through to those folks, or are you able to?
I'm not really able to get through to those folks mostly. And most of the reasoning is because it takes someone. You have to believe that you can't figure this out without that experience,
Mm,
right? Like without. It reminds me of a story. So I'll tell you the story real quick. I was at my
sure.
friend's apartment for Friendsgiving. This was in a metropolitan area, and I met someone for the first time. We're having a conversation. I'm not brand new to this race talk stuff. I bring up race all the time, purposefully and intentionally, in my life, and I have for the last 30 years. And so this was no exception. Where it was a reverie, so people's guard is down a little bit too, so it helps. And I can't remember exactly what the content of the conversation was, but I had a conversation with a man, and I told him something about the black experience in America. And he says, "Oh, wow, I never heard anything like that." And I said, "Well, you know why you've never heard anything like that? Because the only way you could have heard it is from a black person. And you probably have never asked a black person or talked to a black person about this subject matter." And you could just see the wheels turning after I said that. Him like realizing, that I was giving him insight into a special, set of knowledge that you can only gain from experience, just like there is for any profession, just like there is for anyone's unique experience. Um, so what I find is a lot of people who don't speak with black people, who don't live around black people, who don't commune with black people, who never encounter black people, who don't watch black people and listen to them on their media, um, all of their ideas about black people are from like entertainment mostly, comedy, TV shows, movies. Um, so they're not really getting any kind of realistic picture of what life for Black Americans is like presently and oftentimes historically as well. Um, there has to be some level of acceptance of that reality by the person in order to make any progress. If they don't accept the fact that they can't fully understand the Black American experience without having ever really encountered or made a friendship or had a relationship with a Black person, or even just spoken to any Black people about these issues. There's not really much, I don't think, that can be done to get through to that person. You know, I've been friendly with people sometimes on the stream, right? And when we're friendly, we're getting along, but we're not getting anywhere. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And it kind of mirrors what happens in reality a lot of times. There's a lot of people who joke about the fact that we being Black Americans can only talk with white Americans about sports because, like we can't penetrate
Yeah,
past that line, people don't want to talk about race, white people specifically, like black
yeah.
people care less. So yeah, I mean, I forget what the original question was. Sorry, I'm a little.
I don't remember either. I didn't take my Adderall this morning, so it's cool. But you make a really good point, which is there's two things there. The last thing that you said, which is that white people don't want to talk about race, is true. And in my experience, it is largely due to the fact that regardless of what they publicly say or even say to themselves, most of them are at least subconsciously aware of the way things actually work, and they are hesitant to onboard or invite anything that would. Nobody wants to sit on the edge of their bed and be like, oh, fuck, everything's fucked up. Like, everything's fucked up. We got to fix shit. I got to go to a march now. Like, it's a lot of work onboarding this historical fact and like understanding our reality in that way. I think it's good. I think people should do that. But the fact that I think it's a thing people should do doesn't change the fact that if you are a white person somewhere in that racial hierarchy, you have to like deal with a lot of shit and unpack a lot of stuff if you accept that reality. And most people don't want to do that. And for, I think, understandable reasons, even if I disagree with them. So yeah, like I think that might be like, do you find that might be true or like?
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
think you're right on target with that. I think that not only, I mean, people don't want to do it, right? Like, I mean, that's what it comes down to, right? Like, people don't want to do it, and they don't have to do it.
Mhm.
So, like, um, it's a pretty incredible situation to be in. I have no idea what that might be like,
Yeah.
but to just decide not to do something,
Yeah.
it tickles me, right? Like, I'll be on Twitter sometimes talking with people. This is always a white man I'm talking to, and um, it's always the people who are like, I'm a seeker of truth. I care about learning the truth of these things and blah blah blah. And I'm like, all right, great. Like, come on the show. You could be anonymous. You have nothing to worry about. This and that. Blah blah blah. Do a 30-minute pre-interview Zoom with me. It's private. Nobody will ever know. And like, if you don't want to go on, fine. And then all of a sudden, this impenetrable barrier comes up. People try to do all kinds of things. They try to blame me for. They try to act like I'm the reason why they won't come on. They try to act like if I only did this or that, then they would. But since not, I won't. They all these excuses start coming out. And I just went through this maybe the other day with somebody who did end up applying, but I practically had to beg them. And it was the final tweet where I said, listen, man, I'm making all kinds of sacrifices in order to do this work. I don't get paid for any of this. I have my supporters, my Patreon supporters, but they don't even pay for the cost to run this stuff. And not to mention the time, the emotional and spiritual drain on me from reading countless negative stories about racism that people encounter that leaves people dead, permanently injured, or their lives ruined in all kinds of different ways. It's a lot, And when I said that to him, that was when he agreed, to come on. So, I get that it's difficult. I get that it's difficult to be in a position where you might have to take drastic action. It's a change of your way of life.
Mhm.
That's what we're talking about. We're talking about anti-racism. It's a change in your way of life. And it also means making, if I can be frank, an enemy of the United States government. Because the United States government is an ally of racism. And so it's a difficult situation, right? Like, you're not going to win against America. Everybody, the American government. I think everyone kind of realizes that. So when you're faced with looking at that hill that you have to climb that you can't get up, I get why people would turn away from it. Except, we have no choice. We have to deal with this problem, and you have to deal with the conflict of the fact that your countrymen and women are still suffering from the worst consequences of this legacy of racism and this tyrannical racial hierarchy that we're all under. Um, yeah, you can ignore it. You can. Obviously, we've seen historically that it's possible, right? To just pretend like it doesn't exist, to continue living your life. This is a big country. You can there's still tons of majority white places. Like this is still a heavily segregated country. So you can have your white enclave, you can have your black enclave, you can have your Asian enclave, and that's a lot of what we have here. People kind of being in their own little bubbles. So it doesn't make it any easier to unravel the historical wrongs.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that, since we're going after the U.S. government, is I'll just put all my cards on the table on this. I think we also have to consider the economic barriers to onboarding that information. And there's two sides to that, right? There's, if you're a wealthy white person, you obviously have no interest in internalizing any of this because it would require you to, do away with part of the reason that you're wealthy. So you don't want that. But if you're a poor white person, now you have to onboard the idea that there are other people who in some ways have it worse than you, despite the fact that your life is still shit. And that's a difficult thing for a person who is working 4 jobs and taking care of kids to internalize, particularly if they grew up with bigotry. And I don't want to excuse racism because of economic insecurity. I absolutely am not doing that. But I think it's important to understand that the people at the top of the economic hierarchy have a vested interest in maintaining it. And the people at the bottom of that economic hierarchy are predisposed to not want to examine it, if only because they don't have the fucking time. Which means that in order, in my view, to be an anti-racist, you also have to be an anti-capitalist. If you really want to get work done on that. Or at the very least, you have to be like a social democrat and in favor of like a huge welfare state. So, like, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but that's kind of where I land too.
Um, I mean, I don't think it's just about economics, to be honest. I don't even know if the economic divide is as important as people think it is. Um, I think that, how do I say? Let me think for a second.
Sure.
You're right, of course, about the poor white person who is being asked to accept their privilege, right? Like, and I have had conversations with white men who grew up poor. I'll send it to you after this, and I did probe him, the one I'm thinking of right now, to try to find out, what made you accept, because he was someone who had kind of accepted all of this knowledge. And what he told me was he grew up in Pittsburgh, and he was like, there's literally like a dividing line. You can literally see the difference between white poverty and black poverty. He's like, yeah, we're both living in poverty, but like he grew up having black friends who were also poor, and he saw the differences within their life. And so it was him having that experience of like viewing the differing outcomes and why they occurred, that really allowed him, and then studying the subject matter in college, that really helped him. So, um, yeah, it's difficult. It's not impossible. It kind of, I think, forgive me for going this direction, I guess, but like, I think heart has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
Okay. His heart was open. It was available to take in these ideas. Unfortunately, a lot of people's hearts are closed and not available to take in those ideas. And I don't think it can be summed up by talking about protecting your economic status. And I don't think it can be summed up by um, lamenting your economic status either. I don't think it really covers the reasoning behind why people don't want to go down this road. There's like something beyond that. There's a fear that's far beyond that, that's super powerful, that has been ingrained. Okay. The same way that, we spend so much time talking about the pathology of Black Americans, right? All the traumas that we've been through, the pathologies and patterns that have come about as a result of those traumas that have been reinforced over the generations. But we rarely talk about that in terms of white Americans. White Americans have also been traumatized, heavily traumatized, and have gone through, the flip side of the coin of that trauma. And we never talk about what that means. For me, it means that the ability to empathize with others has been suppressed. That's part of white supremacy. They can't have you empathizing with the people who aren't even human, right? You need to make sure you see them as inhuman. Um, the damage that has done is never discussed. It's invisible, right, to anyone who's not on the receiving end of that lack of empathy. And so it's a complicated issue, and I think that unfortunately, feelings and heart have a lot to do with it more than some of the economics and legal stuff that we kind of focus on in the conversation. That's part of the reason why I started my show, just try to guide people in that direction. Because my study of racism has been a lot of the study of racism at the level of thought, and dealing with it at that level. And that's what led me to believe what I believe about empathy and heart.
Yeah. It's and I do just want to be clear about this, for at least for Twitter's sake. Um, I uh, I do not believe that racism reduces to economic problems. I think economic problems are a large component of racial. That it's this tapestry of suck, and the economic thing is just a thread that's going through it. It's a particularly large thread in my view, but it's still a thread amongst many. I'm not a class reductionist by any means, but
Mm.
I do want to talk about the guy that you said who grew up poor and white. That goes back to, he had proximity to Black people, so he could see what was going on. That's not true for a lot of poor white people. Like,
That's
I
right.
grew up poor and white, but I also grew up poor and white around poor Black people, and like, my best friend's dad got shot by a guy who was in the Klan, and my dad didn't. That leaves an impression on you, right? Like, as a 6 year old. So, like, but again, like, I had that proximity to see, like, this group of people is getting treated worse than me for reasons that don't make any sense, because, like, they're nice people. I go over to their house and they give me food. Like, why would anybody do this? Um, so that
Yeah,
I
but see, this is where it goes back to heart, right?
Yeah.
Because that was your thought, but a lot of people's thought would be they're getting treated that way because they deserve it.
Yeah. But
A
yeah, like,
lot of people believe that.
yeah, yeah. And God, this is and yeah, that's a whole thing. Like, what do you think the genesis of that is? Like, if you or it, it's not going to be a single issue, but like, if what do you think the things
I think
are
it's
that, like,
the bootstrap stuff.
yeah.
Pick yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Like, I mean, that's the present iteration of it, which
Hmm.
is like, okay, how long are we supposed to give these people to pick up their shit? Like, how
Hmm.
long are we supposed to give people to get their stuff together? What's wrong with these people? Like, everything's over, right? It
Hmm.
started. It started. The Civil Rights Act. I mean, didn't we pass that? So what's the problem now? Obviously, maybe people had it right. Maybe they were right about the inferiority of these Black people, because if they weren't inferior, wouldn't they be succeeding just like every other group right now? Look at Black immigrants. So
Yeah.
it's that whole thread, I think, of individualism, of the idea of the American dream, right? Our experience as Black Americans is so far removed from the idea of the American dream, but like, I don't think most of America who is not Black really thinks like that. They
Mm-hmm.
don't think of us as a community as any different from any other community when we really are. We just are. Our history is drastically different from every other group in this country. And so um, it's that lack of historical education. People don't have it, so they don't understand. They, they've been sold an illusion, and they rely on that illusion to make decisions about others. That's what's going on. That's what's been going on. And all I can do is just try to dispel it. Dispel the illusion. Once the illusion is dispelled, then people can make their own choice. Whether it's to continue with the beliefs that they held or whether it's to advance beyond that. So yeah, that's how
Yeah.
I see myself, as just like kind of a facilitator, mentor, teacher, educator, on that path. But
Yeah.
I want everyone to be clear that I don't, people who don't decide to educate themselves or learn more, it doesn't make me happy. Okay. But I'm not looking down on that person or not thinking anything like that. We have one life. People have to choose what they want to do with it. It's your choice. You have that freedom. And yeah, it's up to you. But if we're going to live in a society, if we're going to live in a country, if we're going to call ourselves countrymen and countrywomen, if we're going to be brothers and sisters in humanity, then our experience has to be acknowledged by everyone. The United States government did a great job of making sure that that didn't happen. And I think for the first time in American history, there's a concerted effort to make that happen. And that's why you see the pushback with stuff like the critical race theory, anti-critical race theory laws, and stuff like that. And we'll see where it goes. But it's an exciting time. It actually is hopeful for me, because this is really the first time, like I said, we've had such a concerted effort. Um, and the conversations I have, even with people I disagree with or people who come in, maybe with some racist beliefs or with some, you know, incorrect beliefs about history, they all go well. Man, I haven't had a single one where I was like, this was terrible and I never want to do this again. They've all gone well. Everyone's walked away for the most part with a smile. And it's a starting point. Where it's gonna go, it's not going to be pretty, like it's going to be real messy. I don't know how this is all going to play out. It's inevitable. Let me ask you something real quick. It's inevitable, right? That
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be over. There's too much interracial mingling at this point. Okay. Like half the NBA is biracial, a lot of high profile people are so-called biracial now. So what are we going to do? How are we going to hold on to this hierarchy? It's all about the hierarchy that was created. Once that hierarchy crumbles, none of this stuff is going to hold up anymore. So there is a sense of inevitability there. But as you can see, there are political forces who want to stagnate that progress. So that's what's concerning right now. We'll see how far they're willing to go, and we'll see how willing people are to push back. I can't say I'm very hopeful on that front because I saw what happened with George Floyd,
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I hope that project is successful. Certainly. I think I share your. I do my absolute best not to be a doomer publicly, because I don't think that that's productive. But in my private moments, I do have some days I wake up and wonder if, man, we're kicking water uphill real hard is a lot of what we're doing.
But that's what you got to do sometimes
Yeah.
to make progress, right? Sometimes you just have to go through that process, and then all of a sudden you're over the hill and you didn't even realize, But like I feel like that's kind of what's going to happen, except for it's just I don't see violence not being a part of it.
Yeah.
I just don't see it. So my goal is to try to limit the number of casualties and injuries and physically and mentally to people on this journey.
Yeah.
To get people to accept that this is a journey that we're on and that we're always gonna be on it. Like
Yeah.
this is a lifelong, generations long, forever long battle um, against dehumanization.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it really is just, and maybe that's a better way to think of it than an individual effort where kicking water uphill or whatever metaphor I used. Rather, we all got dumped into this river of like fate that preceded us and will outlast us, and like the best, it's beholden on us to try to move within it in the best way that we can and maybe help
Well, you
bring
just
some
have to
other people.
decide. Listen,
Yeah.
you don't have any obligations. You don't
Yeah.
have any obligation, like you have an inheritance, right?
Mhm.
You have an ancestral inheritance. It's unfortunate that you can't give an inheritance back, right? Like an inheritance, you get it. It's something you get whether you want it or not. And yeah, it's unfortunate to inherit the negative consequences of racism, but it's just as unfortunate sometimes in some regards to inherit the power wielding aspects of racism. Something you never wanted, something that's put on you that you never asked for, and how are you supposed to go about the world, especially a country like America that, get ahead any way you can, right? That's a lot of people's mindset here. So, of course, if you have a leg up in terms of being a white person and you know that, you're going to take advantage of that. And there's all kinds of messages encouraging people to do that. So it goes back to you need to be anti-capitalism thing too, because it's all tied in. I agree. So yeah, it is an uphill battle, man. There's a lot of work to do. I think that's why for me, I start by tackling individual people's hearts because um, we need to do a lot of self reflection that is long overdue
Mhm.
on this subject matter. I don't think we can get anywhere without doing that. I don't think any kind of large scale effort is going to do anything if individuals are not ready to accept reality. And that's what
Yeah.
we were talking about earlier. And there's a lot of people who are not ready to do that. I mean, some people can't even accept that Biden won the 2020 election. So, like,
Yeah. 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 Speaking of reality, where we seem to be living in parallel realities that just sort of intersect with each other occasionally, and none of us can figure out what the other side is talking about. And that seems to be accelerating and further entrenching itself. So, I, yeah, I think, well, I know you wanted to talk about this as well, but like education, I think probably is one of the foundational things to solving that problem. And that's kind of your you're a teacher by trade, and education is a hobby horse of yours here recently, in particular. So, what is it that you're focusing on in that realm?
so there's a couple areas. One is history of race and racism. Okay, so Ibram X. Kendi, I knew there was going to be an issue as soon as I read Ibram X. Kendi's first book, which was Stamped from the Beginning. And it's a history of racism, like the history of the creation of race and racism.
Hmm.
And it's very well cited. He spent a lot of times in the U.S. Historical Archives finding out information, and it's a great read. Very difficult read though, and it won the National Book Award. But he is now widely known for not for that book that won the National Book Award, but for How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? Which was his follow-up book, a book that was supposed to be more accessible to a less academic audience, and that was somewhat obviously related to, but somewhat outside the realm of his specialty of history. So yeah, he's known for that because it was an easier target, right? They were able to
Hmm.
target him for some of the things that he said in that book, but there's really nothing to target about his historical research, which I think is great. And so I think we need to focus on what actually happened in history. You know, what are some facts that we can bring up that are indisputable, that create a story that we can all agree on?
Hmm.
Um, it doesn't solve the problem, right? Because ultimately, the story that makes the most sense, and of course, is my opinion, but I think it's hard to disagree with, is I think looking at American history makes the most sense if you look at it as a bunch of different groups being oppressed and, you know, overcoming or like moving outside of that oppression, right? Outside of that box that they were put in. I mean, every single group that's ever been here was oppressed in some way or another. And it's a good way of looking at history because it shows our progress over time, right?
Hmm.
But it also doesn't discount where we've been. That's what we've done so far. We've discounted where we've been. We've kind of removed a lot of key elements that would allow people to understand our present. So a lot of people can't understand what's going on right now or are susceptible to propaganda that's creating and furthering the illusion of what's going on right now, um, you know, for their own gain. Um, and that's what we got to stop. We got to make sure that people have the information to know. No, what was done was a tyrannical racial hierarchy was put on all of us. It impacts all of us to this day. It's never been undone. The government was a huge part of it in propagating it. So too was the church. And and we need to continuously work to make sure that that never happens again, but also that the legacy of it is the power of the legacy of it is diminished. If we can start from that common ground, then we can start talking about how to do that, right?
Hmm.
But we can't even get to that common ground. So, in terms of education, that's what I think we need to do is build that foundation.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. I have a fair bit of smoke for the way the diversity, equity, and inclusion thing has propagated its way through our the halls of corporate power. I I still haven't. I own a copy of Elite Capture by Taiwo, and I've read the original essay, which I think is wonderful and everybody should read. But I'm sure the book is also good. I just haven't gotten around to it. But I I think that there's a lot of barriers to what you're talking about in terms of like education because number one, just the American education system is not designed to teach actual history. And then any attempt to teach that history is met with invariably some cries of, I mean, just look at like the response to the 1619 Project, right? Like, America is irrevocably stained and we can never recover, and all white people need to crucify and self flagellate themselves in the town square. When is it enough? When are we done? That's not what it's about, man. And you know that's not what it's about. You're just interested in maintaining this hierarchy. However, for the people in the streets, like the actual, like common, like working class white people, like average folks who went through that education system, they are very susceptible to that messaging of this isn't about equity or equality. This is about making you pay for the sins of your ancestors. And that is very dangerous. And I don't know a workaround to that, but I think it starts with education. Just coming up with the history is better than learning it in your 40s, right?
Yeah, I mean, either way,
Yeah.
I'll take
Yeah.
either one at this point. But
They're both good, but like in terms of social progress and like resistance to that type of top down manipulation, I think it's better if you're primed. And so, like,
100%,
yeah,
100%. We want people growing up having an accurate understanding, or at least a more accurate one than most people have right now, of of past history of race and racism. Yeah, you're right about the barriers. There's always going to be a backlash to any anti-racist effort.
Mm,
Um, but you know, and no, do I think that the education system should be seen as the best conduit for educating people? Maybe not. That's why I'm seeking other ways. My goal is to travel around and to host live events and give people an opportunity to learn that way. Of course it would be voluntary. And so that's an issue. But we got to start somewhere. We got to start with the people who are open to learning.
mm,
And then go from there. But yeah, you're exactly right. There's all kinds of barriers. I mean, a lot of Republicans are openly talking about trying to destroy public education at this point. And so I think that they'd sooner do that than allow people to be educated about the truth of racial hierarchies and racism. So, yeah, I
mm,
don't know the answer. All I know is what I can do. What I can do is continue to create space for those conversations to allow people to express themselves and respond and try to share my perspective. There's really not much else I can do. I don't have the
yeah.
power to do anything else. So um, I try not to think about whether it'll work or not.
Hmm.
Like one of my guests, who's a retired professor, he called me up maybe a few weeks ago, and he was like, "You're not going to win, right?" Talking to me about what I'm doing, and I was like, "Yeah, that's not my mindset. My mindset isn't like if I do this, I'm going to win. It's more like a decision I've made, the same decision that other people need to make or not. Which is, but you need to make one, which
Hmm.
is you're either going to be anti-racist, which means that you're going to be in a lifelong struggle against racism, or you're not. Okay, and that if and so you just have to decide what you're going to do. Are you going to make that sacrifice of your money, of your time, of your emotional and spiritual labor? It's a question.
Hmm.
And if the answer is no, the answer is no. And for a lot of people the answer is no, and that's fine. Okay, you are allowed to make that choice. Is it going to bring this country to its knees? Yes, it's inevitable if we do not do something about it. And so, if people are okay with that reality, that's their choice. But I at least want people to make the choice, understanding the actual reality instead of whatever they're being force fed.
Yeah, yeah, and I think an actual legitimate full understanding of the truth and scope of that truth sort of impinges upon you to do something, like, even if it's, having a conversation with your it's just literally, you don't have to start a podcast, right? Like,
Yeah,
I
like
am I am firmly a believer that podcasters don't deserve rights. We're the only group of people it's okay to discriminate against. Like, that's my stance. Disagree with me or not, it's fine. But that's where I am on that. But yeah, you don't have to do this. You just
no, I'm
yeah.
doing this because I'm a teacher. I
Hmm.
have a lot of experience communicating ideas, and I've studied race extensively since I was a child, and I have a lot of experiences, and I know how to incorporate them in explaining things to people and make connections with people. That's the
Hmm.
reason I decided to do this. But I'll give you an example. So one of my friends, he's a white man. I went to college with him. We've been friends for a couple decades now, and he's my moderator for the show. He has a black supervisor at his job, and after he started modifying these episodes, he brought up the show to his supervisor. And from that moment, their relationship has grown extensively. He came back to me about the conversation they had. He said, when I brought it up, we talked for like an hour and a half about race and race. He's like, we've never talked about this stuff before. And they got so much closer, he said, from having that conversation. Now they regularly do. They work better together now. They understand each other more. And I think that the stories he heard from that gentleman, his supervisor, impacted him more than anything I've ever told him, even though we've been friends for these decades. I could just tell from the way he was explaining and describing. So, like you said, just communicating with people, right? If you have someone to communicate with, is a really good idea. I also host, I don't think I mentioned earlier, I still do the racism discussion group stuff. We actually have one tonight. I do it on Zoom now. So we don't do them in person, but anyone can sign up. It's open. And those conversations, all kinds of stuff comes out as well. So yeah, you don't have to start a podcast. You just have to, what you have to do is just as hard though, which is make a choice. That choice is not an easy choice. I recognize that, and I'm not going to pretend like um, it's a simple thing because, like you said earlier, that choice means that you are, to a certain extent, if you're a white American, working against your own interest. All right. Like, it's not easy to make a decision to work against your own interest or to make a sacrifice, I guess is a better way of describing it. It involves sacrifice. And Black America is well acquainted with the idea of sacrifice. We've had no choice but to sacrifice. But white America has been able to sidestep sacrifice generationally. And so now you're supposed to give all that, you're supposed to change all that. I like talking about this stuff because it's like, we never talk about the backside of the culture, right? A lack of empathy, an inability to sacrifice. Like, these are the consequences of white supremacy. And that's what we have to overcome if we're ever going to move the needle forward. I don't know how to do that without government intervention. I don't think it's really possible. I think all we can do is force the government to admit where it stands again, which I think will happen.
Yeah, that is the consequences of white supremacy on white people is an interesting subject because it's not something that is centered very often, and I think for appropriate reasons, right? You don't want to make a conversation about dismantling white supremacy a woe is me conversation about white folk. But that said, it fucks white people up. Like it makes white people, it robs them in many ways of their empathy, like you said. This like hyper individualized mentality that we all have, not all of us, but like that is sort of in the bedrock of white American culture is really dysfunctional. Like it makes for just it's bad for your soul, right? Like it's not
That's a
good.
good way of putting it, brother.
Like, and like you said earlier, working against racism is not in white people's best interest necessarily, and that it involves sacrifice and stuff. I
Yeah.
think it actually I mean, in some ways, but like it is in my interests to live in a world where everybody cares about everybody else, regardless of, their skin color and, their historical lineage. And that's a better world to live in because the consequences of racism on me effectively are that I have to bootstrap my way into being a billionaire or I'm worthless in that hierarchy, right? Like it impinges on me as well. And its claws are in me to make me like this vicious person in the hierarchy. And you can just reject that if you want to. It takes
It's not
work.
easy though. Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
easy to reject it, like because you're being attacked from all sides, you're surrounded. And they're surrounding you, trying to get you to take advantage of advantages that you have.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not like you're being forced into prison or something. You're being forced to make money. Ooh.
Woe is me. Yeah.
So like, I mean, I get that the choice is very confusing and that's why it goes back to education, because you gotta educate yourself to even know to make that choice. And yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just the culture's so fucked up. Like, and it's one of those things where like you don't know what you don't know. But I do wonder, like, how we in America it is possible to be a white person and legitimately not understand any of this. And I don't know. I have a hard time empathizing with that because like I'm a terminally online communist. Like I don't know, I have a really speaking of a failure of empathy, I have a really hard time putting myself in the shoes of somebody who has so thoroughly isolated themselves from the world that they don't understand that other people are suffering historical consequences. So I have a hard time trying to reach across that barrier to educate people. And I don't know, how do you do that? Because obviously, I feel like that's got to be harder for you, even. Like,
I
I don't.
think it is hard for me. Like it reminds me of another story, which I had a black professor, a female professor, in teaching civil procedure in law school, and first 10 minutes she spent basically just like naming her credentials, talking about her experience clerking for a Supreme Court justice, name dropping people, doing this kind of thing, just to set up her legitimacy at the beginning, because she knew that, the almost fully white class, I was the only black person in there, 80 people, and were, you know, going to be judging her based on the fact that she's black. And the same thing kind of happens to me, right? Like I'm not an authority just because I'm black, which I wouldn't say that I am just because I'm black, but like I do have specialized knowledge because I'm black. And that idea is something people just want to reject. It's very uncomfortable for a lot of people. Um, Sorry, can you repeat your question? Because I do want to answer. I totally forgot.
So how do you
Oh, right.
have that like that empathy for people that are so alienated from this discussion that they in the world today they just can't even understand the problem like that.
Yeah.
I have a problem empathizing with those people. I imagine you have possibly an even more difficult time doing so, but you seem to do
Um,
so.
Not really empathizing with them. I don't really have trouble with. What I have trouble with is getting through to them, right? Like
Mhm.
getting them to understand. And so how I do that is I actually use empathy to do it, right? So how do I it's a little hard to explain. But I guess the best way to say it is when you believe something that's not true, when you are holding on to a false narrative, reality will always there's always going to be like kind of well if you believe something is not true, then you're creating a conflict with reality, right? So what I try to do is understand what the person actually does believe and think, and then I'm pretty good at finding those pressure points with reality that are paradoxes that they won't be able to resolve instantly. um, and then I confront people with those paradoxes and see what happens. Typically, what happens is one of two things: either they will create some new justification for what they believed, because the old one they've been confronted with its lack of reality, a lack of truth. But that's extremely difficult for most people to do in a moment. So instead, what it often does is open the door for the first time to the acceptance that they might be wrong, and there might be a better way or a different way of thinking about it. So I used kind of a system of paradoxes that I developed over a series of time in order to do that. It's highly effective, but it's not lasting, I would say, right? Like people have like glimmers of breakthroughs, and then they'll be back thinking the same thing they were thinking with a couple more episodes of Fox News.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you, are there any particular like vectors in there, questions that you have found come up over and over again that like people who are listening to this might find useful in their conversations if they elect to have them?
I think it's important for people to think about whether they actually have any kind of personal relationships with Black people. Do you know any Black people? Do you ever talk to them? Have you ever talked to them about race? You know, do you think that that's a necessity in order to understand race? Because most people will agree with the statement that I'll never understand what it's like to be a Black person in America. Even if like you don't know Black people, you don't know anything about racism, most people will agree with that statement because most people just understand that that's reality. You know that you can't understand someone just because you know that they're white or you know that they're Black, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I don't know, man. Like, I guess one thing is, so I had a conversation with somebody, and there's a clip on my YouTube channel right now about this. He told me that it was crazy that I think that we live in a white supremacist nation.
Hmm.
And so I asked him, I was like, all right, so do you believe that we have a history, a long and storied history of white supremacy in the country, in our laws, in our religious institutions, in our economic system, our medical system? And he was just like, yeah, no, I agree with that. And I was like, okay, so um, when did we stop being a white supremacist society? And then he was thinking for like 20 seconds because right, like if you challenge someone to think about when it ended,
Mm-hmm.
most people can only point to the Civil Rights Act, right? And then that at least gives you kind of a door to talk about history, right? And to talk
Mm-hmm.
about the realities of history, um, including the realities of Reconstruction, which I think is a huge gap in most people's historical understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of a meme for me at this point, but like I will frequently just say we need to redo Reconstruction. Like it's just like you know that meme where it's like the guy is hitting the tiny little domino and then it eventually is a wall. Like you can put 90% of our problems racism at that tiny little domino of the North pulling out of Reconstruction like way before they should have. Like that is yeah, that's a huge thing.
Yeah, and you know it's a huge thing because you've studied it, right? But
Mm,
like most people have no concept of that. People think, and that's why the whole bootstraps and Black people are just whining now. Common narrative is out there, and that's why it's so effective because people don't know about that. People have no idea.
mhm.
So yeah,
And and then the civil rights movement, like the thing that jumps out to me is right. That's like 1968, I want to say, or 69, or the Civil Rights Act. Anyway, is it 68 or 69? I can't remember.
I think
Doesn't
it's
matter.
68, right?
Yeah, I want to say 68. Anyway, that
Well,
Civil
there's the
Rights
Civil Rights Act of 1964. Sorry, I was thinking about something else.
64, and then there was a second one. Yeah. Anyway,
19.
you get
Yep.
those people to admit that like or to say that's when racism officially ended, right? Like in 1968 the US government waved a magic wand and ended all racial inequality in America in 1968. And then you ask that's a good vector because that's three people ago. Like did all those people who suffered the long chain of historical inequality re um, wealth aggregation and segregation and you know just this whole litany of shit, did that get fixed in 2 generations, and how, like what is the mechanism by
That's
which that
exactly right.
was
Those are the
done?
kind of questions
Yeah,
that I ask people. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
that's
there's no answers, obviously, because
yeah.
people don't know. So, but it at least gets people thinking, right? You know, like, huh, like, I don't know. I don't know if you're familiar with Angel Eduardo.
I'm
He's
not.
one of
No.
the advisors on the board of advisors for FAIR, which is
Okay.
that institution against racism and intolerance and racism. He came on my stream and we talked for a while about anti-racism and whatnot, and we had kind of a similar conversation like that. I was like, do you have any idea how white supremacy operates like in our society today? You know, like, do you think it was gone? I mean, we started there. Like, do you think it ended? Do you think it was over? He was like, no. I was like, well, do you know how it operates today? He was like, no. And then I was like, okay, well, why do you believe you have a solution to it? Because that's what he was doing. He was presenting a solution like this will solve the problem. And I was like, you also admitted that you don't know what the problem is. Like, and we couldn't get past that. That like he was like, well, this is what I believe. And I'm like, but don't you think it's irresponsible to believe that when you acknowledge that you don't really know all this pivotal stuff that you would need to know in order to come up with a solution? And it's just like I couldn't get past that brick wall. So, when I have these conversations, I just like try to bring people as far as I can, and if people want to come back and go forward, we can do that. Some people I've talked to for 20 hours, literally, total. So like, I'm invested, man.
That's deep. I don't know if I could do that. I don't have the stamina for repeated contact with a brick wall like that. Have you put
I'm
chips in
very
them?
stubborn and I'm very curious person.
Yeah.
So,
How many how many of those like ongoing long-term conversations do you think you've made like an impact in the person that you're speaking to?
none.
No.
Typically, yeah, none.
Yeah.
Typically, when I engage in those longer ones, it's
Mhm.
because I'm trying to break through and I'm being unsuccessful, or because there's something in the person's thought pattern that I haven't experienced and I'm trying to understand it more. But like, it never
Yeah.
actually comes out to be.
Yeah.
Like,
And truth be told, like in the medium that you operate in, like it's not necessarily that you're trying to convince the person that you're speaking to. You're trying to convince the people that they bring to the audience. Is more.
not even, man. I want people to, if all people experienced was seeing a conversation about race where people aren't screaming at each other, where no one gets upset,
Mm,
where it's calm and collected, but like it's a decent conversation. That's fine for me. That's a win for me. Because we're not even at that point. People are so scared. I'm telling you, that fear is something that
yeah.
is it's next level fear. It's a fear like I have literally seen the fear of like death in people's eyes just by asking them a question about race. Just from asking a question. Like, so I've just seen it too many times. I can catalyze it. I've paralyzed multiple people. Literally, they could not move. They could not speak. And I could anticipate that this would happen. Like,
What gets
so
them? Like, what's the
let me tell you the story.
all right?
That came up. But like,
Like what's your kill shot?
so I mean, you don't even need like a specific one. Like it's very situational. So in
Hmm.
this one situation, I was the only black person at a bachelor party. We got an Airbnb. We're chilling, we're hanging out. I drove some of the boys to the store. We picked up supplies. We came back. We're chilling here. I've been there for maybe 4 hours at this point. One of the guys sits next to me and he says, "Aren't you the what do you say? Aren't you the what's it called? Sorry, my brain is like not fully functioning right now. But building manager, right?
Mm.
Aren't you the building manager? And like, why are you hanging out with us?
Oh shit!
Yeah, and I've been here for 4 hours.
Oh no!
Um, I was like, yeah, I'm not the building manager. Um, he's like, so you're just gonna like hang out? it's like me telling him meant nothing. And so anyway, this situation happens. I get up. I
It's
sit
like,
next to someone else. This is like immediately after. I'm having a conversation with this other person. And 5 minutes into this conversation, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to bring up what happened. I'm going to see what happens. So I tell him what happened. And he goes, what? And I was like, yeah, like, like this just happened. The next thing that he said had absolutely nothing to do with what the story I told, had nothing to do with the conversation we were having before I told the story. It was something totally unrelated to anything that we had discussed. So, like, I tell this story just like I told you.
mm-hmm.
Next thing he says is something completely unrelated to anything that we've discussed.
Hmm.
I've never experienced anything like that before. I was like, and I answered him because like it was like almost like jumping into the middle of a conversation that that you can follow. So I just like went along with it, but I was just like, that is one of the weirdest communication interactions that I've ever experienced. Now, before he did that, he was frozen. Like he literally was frozen. I could see like as if a robot was powered down. And so anyway, 10 minutes after that, we're standing in a circle. This guy's there, some other people are there, and I get the idea, and I'm like, if I do this again, he's going to have the same reaction because that's what it was. It was so it was so ingrained. It was something so fundamental and core to him. I was like, he could not deal with it. So I was just like, hey, so remember that conversation we had a little bit ago? He was like, yeah. All I asked him was, what do you think about that? That's literally all I asked. What do you think about that? Same reaction, frozen. He could not. He could not do anything, and everybody else is just like, "What the hell?" They didn't even know the story, so they didn't have the context, right? But like, I was able to recreate that. There's all kinds of other stories just like that where I see that same freeze reaction. This fear, this unbridled fear that you may have to acknowledge that racism even exists. You know, that same situation, there were four of us sitting on the couch. Like it was like a big open room. Everyone else was out and we were like straggling behind. And I told them the story. One white guy who's sitting on the couch there, he leans in. There's no one here. It's dead silent there. He leans in and he goes, I was like, what do you think about it? He's like, it sounds racist. He literally whispered it. Like it was dead silent and he whispered it. And I was like, why are you whispering? And we all burst out laughing because of how absurd it was. But like, those are the kind of absurdities that happen just because you're even talking about it. Can you even imagine thinking about fighting against it? You can't even talk about it. So, I mean, that's why I just focus on education. I focus on communication. I focus on removing fear because I mean it's severe, it's extreme, it's something I've never experienced myself. It's outside of my experience, so I don't know what they're feeling inside, but like it's obviously something so terrifying. I mean, it seemed like life or death.
Yeah, I don't really get that reaction either, like honestly, but also like my first reaction to like you telling me that story was like, oh, I bet that's the same type of motherfucker that like thinks every black person in Target works there, right? Like, like, excuse me, sir, can you help me with this? It's like, I don't fucking work here. Why are you talking to me, right? So, but like, that's
I don't know, man. But like, it's just crazy. Like I shouldn't be able to predict that I can paralyze you with my work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
yeah, I don't know. Like, I think maybe that's the whole like, because if you acknowledge that, you have to like, there's this whole, like we said it like kind of earlier on in the conversation, you have to like unpack like so much shit just to acknowledge that. It's easier to just like turtle up and change the conversation and hope nobody notices, like, because now you got to
I don't even think he did it purposefully, to be honest. It seemed like he was on autopilot. It seemed like it happened totally without his conscious thought. That's what scared me. That's what worried me about it. I was like, you're not even in control of your own mind right now. It was horrifying. Anyway.
Like, bro, did you just reboot? Like, what the
Yeah,
fuck was that?
literally. It was just like that. I was like, what happened to you? I have no idea.
Yeah, that's I don't know. That is funny as hell though. But yeah, like I don't know how.
I got a lot of stories, bro. I want to write them all down and like, I want to get them out there, but I don't know how I want to put them out yet. Maybe in
Yeah,
book form or maybe article by article. I'm not sure.
you should do like a graphic novel, and then you can like have illustrations of just like white people like rebooting anytime a message of racism comes up, just like the like the long like anime like
Yeah, it's
face.
literally. Oh my god.
Yeah. Um. So yeah, like that. So when you encounter that type of stuff, like I mean, that was obviously in your personal life, but like if you're doing this in public, what's your like for the purposes of trying to like have like these breakthrough things, like how do you pivot from that into something that's productive, or are you able to, or at that point are you just like noting that this person is not a good target? Like
Yeah,
what's your
it's
reaction to that
it's the
professionally?
latter. Yeah,
Yeah.
because honestly, I was afraid I would kill him. Like, I was like, I don't know what's going on here. Whatever it is something so far beyond the scope of like my understanding that I should not even get involved with this. Like I mean, I wasn't expecting that to happen the first time. The second time it was, but like, I yeah, I'm only trying to reach people right now at this moment who are open,
Hmm.
right? Because that's all the power that I have. I don't really have the power or the skill to break down whatever that was. you know? So yeah, I just we laughed about it, like we all saw what happened. They all knew what it was, and I just left it at that, like you saw that. That's it. Like just seeing it, that's a win, I take my wins where I can get them, and they may be small, but at least somebody saw that who wouldn't maybe think
Yeah.
that such a thing could happen before.
Yeah. And maybe that's like the if we can end on like a very special episode moment, like maybe that's the takeaway is, it's little small victories, little incremental, like again, like nobody is forcing any obligation on you if you're listening to this to if you're already on team racism bad and exist, you don't have to dedicate your entire life, body, and soul to this. You can just have little conversations here and there, like move the needle where you can when you can, and then
Yeah. And empower people who have
yeah,
given their whole life, mind, and body and soul, like
yeah,
myself, to doing it. It took me 3 years to decide to really pursue the
hmm,
contraband wagon. Why? Because I was finding the courage to dedicate and to devote myself fully to it.
yeah,
So I appreciate any support anyone's willing to give. I do have a Patreon, www.patreon.com/ the contraband wagon. For $3 a month, you get access to all of the uncut recordings I've done. There's over 70 now.
nice,
They're minimum 2 hours long. So, I mean, there's tons of content for you there. There's all kinds of interesting guests. You can cycle through, find somebody you're interested in hearing from. Or you can just be a guest on the show, apply. Anyone's welcome as long as you come with an open heart and open mind. Go to www.thecontrabandwagon.com, click the submit application button. It's like a 1 minute long application to fill out. I'll get back to you via email. We'll have a 30-minute pre-interview Zoom conference where we'll talk about what we might discuss, and you can ask any questions, and you can decide whether you want to be on the show, and we'll schedule a date and time. And boom, you're on the show.
nice. Well, I think that's a good spot to leave it on. Contraband. Do you have any other pluggables that you want to plug?
You can follow me on Twitter at Contrabands Mouth. I think it's Contrabands M. It's actually the name. And yeah, I just encourage everyone out there not to lose hope, even in the face of an approaching doomsday, um, because guys, progress happens through conflict. We can't avoid conflict forever, and we've been avoiding this racial conflict. We've been trying to pretend like we can waylay it, like time will heal it. I think we all realize now that that's not the case. And I want you guys to try your best to embrace that, okay? Embrace the challenge, embrace this new experience, and remember that the whole point of anti-racism is so that we can come together as one human family, human beings, which is what we really are. So thank you all out there for listening, and thank you so much. I really appreciate you, Mark, for having me on here. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an absolute pleasure. Contraband, thanks for coming on the show. Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards again, and I just wanted to thank you for watching or listening to the show, however you get your content. And yeah, I just wanted to say thanks again at the end here, like I usually, frequently, always do. If you would like to support the show financially, you can do so on Patreon at ultravioletpod.com. You can become a patron. And the people who do that get their names somewhere in here in the dibbly-doo. I think it's in this direction, if my proprioception is working correctly. But somewhere around here on the YouTube channel. And at some point, I'm going to figure out a benefit to give you for that, other than just a warm, fuzzy feeling you get when the $1 or $5 or whatever you choose to give gets withdrawn from your bank account every month. If you have any suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments. As the channel grows, I'm happy to provide benefits to people who support me. So with the provision that the content itself is always free. So if you have any ideas, reach out, feel free to do so. You can also support me individually, like as a one-time thing on Venmo, Coffee, PayPal. All of that is also at Ultraviolet Pod. And please be sure to support the guests as well. Contraband has a Patreon, so please go out and check that out and subscribe. You get access to all of his content forever and ever, as I understand it, because most of it's on Twitch and that rolls over. So if you want like all the archives, you got to subscribe to his stuff. So be sure and do that. If you cannot support the show financially directly, I get that. I have been in a situation where I couldn't part with any money like that, and I totally understand. And I'm not talking to you when I make those asks, but you still can support the show. You can comment on the videos on YouTube, which really helps with the algorithm. You can like, subscribe to me on all platforms, and you can leave ratings and reviews on iTunes, Spotify, anywhere that you're able to do so. And you can share the content on Twitter or your blog or anywhere that you're going to have a reach publicly. All of that really helps, and I really appreciate it. If you want to follow me directly on social media, I am at Ultraviolet Pod on Twitter, where I mostly shitpost and occasionally say something halfway insightful. I'll leave it to you to be the judge of that. I am also on Instagram, though very infrequently, and I only ever post pictures of my cat. So if that's something you're interested in, go check that out. He's a very good fuzzy boy. And occasionally I'm on Twitch at UVPod, where I will very infrequently stream Stardew Valley or whatever video game is of interest to me. And yeah, that's pretty much all the things I think that I need to plug. Yep. Cool. All right. Well, thanks. I'll see y'all later. And I probably need to go take my ADD meds. Okay, bye.